For 10,000 years, the tales told the same lie, that a space marine is chosen, that the gene gift falls only upon the worthy, that sanctity and destiny conspire to lift a boy into legend. The truth begins in cages. The screening yards are at the edge of things, of civitas, of law, of mercy. They sit downwind from the manufactorum stacks, where iron is sung into shape and powdered bone mixes with metal filings. The lights there are not sunlight. They are the measured red of emergency lamps and the steely white of inspection panels, and they fall across faces like verdicts. That is how it begins. Not with trumpets or banners, but with a crate and a number burned into flesh. I am Drill Abbot Sarax Varda, keeper of induction protocols for the 10th screening cohort, and for 32 standard years I have presided over the first files of the Adeptus Astartes. I signed the warrants. I read the manifests. I stand by while the servitors do what the servitors must do. I have seen boys become steel, and I have watched steel become ash. Both processes are instructive. They arrive at night. They come chained in convoys from refugee hive wards and agri-planets and frontier bastions, where the commissars collect what the commissariat calls potential. Each candidate is catalogued, name if one exists, birthmark, scar, a number stamped into the outer right forearm by a sputtering pyrobrand. Some names are song-like, most are the iterated code of a life that counted for little. They arrive with possessions fewer than a servitor's ration, a cloth, a prayer bead, a child's tooth wrapped in scrap. We take these things, we place them on the registry shelf and file them under a different order. Candidate 7241, Aaron Voss, was thin as regret. He came from Chryse 9, a dust-worn planet where the horizon is an endless curtain of wind, and the children learn not to count on promises. He had a precision about his gaze that made senior drill sergeants uncomfortable, an assessment of torque, of exit angles, of how weight shifts under panic. That is not bravery, that is calculation. The difference matters. The first ritual is unremarkable in description and catastrophic in consequence. The Obedience March. We march them across the basalt plain beneath artificially hung night. They have been told it is a test of endurance, of will. We tell them lies because at the edges of the Imperium, faith needs scaffolding. The night is engineered to make breath shallow. The furnaces vent a fine particulate that burns in lungs. At pre-arranged markers, we call out commands. A man sits down and refuses to stand. He is taken. A woman's hands go still when the pressure in the air shifts. Servitors take her. The rest move on. The ones who remain are not uniformly brave. Some have nerves of metal. Some simply have the capacity to hide their fear better. A certain percentage fail less because they cannot move, and more because they cannot obey. Obedience is the first alloy we press into them. The Emperor's angels are first forged by yes. The apothecaries make a theater of science. Their halls stink of antiseptic and old iron. They will tell you in official accounts that gene augury is the crucible, that the gene seed responds only to purity of lineage and flame of spirit. They will print charts and technical papers. They will point to sequences and cryo readouts. Those documents are not lies, but they are incomplete. I have watched an apothecary probe a boy's blood with the clinical kindness of a surgeon assessing a wound. He lifts a vial, reads its data, and his shoulders do not move. Then he walks the line with his reductor in hand and chooses not by charts alone, but by a thing you can only feel if you have done the choosing before. A subtle cadence in a heartbeat, a phantom rhythm in the throat that tells him whether this specimen will be able to blend flesh and gene without dissolving. There is art in his hands. There is judgment. We catalog the failures. They are named. Station number 4, 7, 7, 9 keeps the gene sample ledger in triplicate. We have shelves for contaminated seed and shelves for viable strands. The contaminated vials are burned in a kiln whose heat knows no mercy. Their glass turns black, and the smoke carries a sweetness that never leaves the nose. We keep records of numbers so the administratum can sleep at night. Percentages, cohorts, loss rates. These are our measured griefs. They are not poetic candidate. Aron Vos passed the second hurdle. He bled true blood in required metrics. His marrow accepted the first enzymes without producing corrosive sludge. He impressed the apothecaries by not flinching when they introduced the microsplices that would begin to rearrange his bones. He clenched his jaw, and something in him answered without the need for prayer. That is how he moved from the cage to the intake list. But the process does not end with acceptance. Acceptance is the doorway into erasure. They teach them to lose names. On induction day, we line the new postulants before the sanctum. Each man steps forward, announces his name, origin, and token to the chaplain. The chaplain rings a prayer bell with 3 strikes and intones the canon. He calls the boy to the emperor. The boy answers. Then the drill abbots, the apothecaries, the commissars, each takes a turn. During the taking of the gene pledge, we carve into their flesh the marks of their brotherhood, and we take their names. You will be chapter and number, we tell them. Your family dies, so our family may live. It is a hard sentence. It is true. Aron Vos said little. When the needle kissed his skin and the scent of burning salt and fever rose, he looked up at me, straight at me, with the same motion he had used when watching the bars in his cage. For a moment, I thought I saw the child he had been, a numberless thing. Then the chaplain spoke the right, and the name left him as if removed by a clean blade. He inhaled, and he was no longer Aron Vos. He was candidate 7241, 10th screening cohort. There is a private cruelty in that renunciation, a slicing away that is not merely ceremonial. We teach them to answer to numbers because numbers bind better than names. Numbers are ledger entries, names are accidents of history. A name makes you human, a number makes you an asset. The empire is efficient. Not all transformations are irreversible. Many are, painfully and finally, reversible by policy and by law, by exterminatus, by quarantine, by the apothecary's last refusal. We put such cases into the ledgers too. We mark them with a small black seal and file them beneath the rubric, unsuitable. Their families, if any remain, are notified. The notices come in the form of terse communiques that express regret and offer condolences. They do not explain the scorch marks, the servitor wounds. They do not deliver the silence that follows watching one you raised remade as something that will kill without hesitation. Yet some pass wholly into the machine. They endure the gene splicing and the bone expansion and the long months of conditioning where sleep becomes a tactical liability and memory is trimmed until nothing but function remains, the conditioning halls of Veritus. Minor have walls that remember every oath. The prayer bells toll when a recruit fails, and they toll again when a recruit rises. In those nights, I have stood outside and listened to the bells and wondered whether the sound was for the fallen or for the living man who had to keep living afterward. Candidate 7241, Aron Vos, survived the nights. He learned the cadence of a rifle as if it were a hymn. He learned to move like a thing that had no expectation of mercy and to answer in unison when called. He learned to put aside the image of the boy in the cage and take up the image of the warrior. That is what the Imperium rewards. Still, there are always moments Arenes came during the endoceramic trials. We test them for endurance and for what we have always called soul adhesion, the capacity of the marrow to bond with ceramite without rejecting it as poison. He stood in the chamber, the plates clamped to his shoulders, and the air was full of a fine white dust. The monitor flashed acceptable. The surgeon's gauntlet paused. The chaplain whispered a benediction. Aaron did not smile. He tilted his head as if listening. "Do you remember your mother?" a corporal asked later, in a voice meant for human ears. He had, for an instant, the look of a man recollecting a song. "She had a scar on her thumb," he said. "She braided my hair with wire when the winds came." The corporal laughed. "You remember small things. Good." Aran's eyes moved toward the vent shafts as if measuring exits. I watched him then as the man he would become, and the child he had been folded together in one brief expression, and I felt something break like ice. This is the truth the stories do not tell. The making of an Astartes is a ledger of losses, not only of those who fail, but of the self that fails and is replaced. We celebrate the result and suppress the mechanics. I speak because someone must put words to the ledger. I write because records are how memory resists erasure, and because in the quiet hours after the bells, I keep a small vial on my desk, a single grain of black sand from a shoreline where the first of his kind went to sleep, and I remember what the cost tastes like. Rumors are the second crucible. If obedience is the first alloy of a future Astartes, rumor is the first fracture that tests it. Recruits hear everything long before the chaplains believe they do. Servitors hum. Drill sergeants mutter. Apothecaries speak in low tones behind glass wards, forgetting that fear sharpens ears. And so the whispers arrive in the dormitorium like mold in a sealed ration tin, quiet, invasive, persistent. What happens to the ones taken by the servitors? Why do some come back without hair or memory? Why does the apothecary keep a reductor on his belt even during lectures? At first, they mutter these in the dim hours between sleep cycles, when the lumen strips cycle down to the color of dying coals, and the ceiling vents exhale warm chemical breath. Then whispers turn to quiet arguments. Then the arguments become frantic denials. Rumor is a weapon with no owner. It cuts uniformly. I learned long ago that the moment rumors begin is the moment innocence ends. It begins with the bodies, not the bodies of the dead. Those are handled with clinical finality and assigned to the crematoria under Code 77A. But the bodies of the changed A-boy fails marrow bonding and begins coughing up black slurry from a reaction he cannot survive. A candidate rejects the first implanted gland, his veins tightening like cables under too much charge. A third survives the night's training, but wakes unable to recall his own name. These are not failures. They are lessons. We bring the candidates to the observation hall. We do not speak. We do not comfort them. We simply pull back the screen and reveal the consequences of imperfection. Rows of transparasteel slabs, rows of still figures, some burned, some peaceful, some contorted by the violence of their own biology. Beneath each, a tag numbers fate. Aaron Vos, candidate 7241, stood among them, jaw set, eyes calculating angles, as though the bodies formed a puzzle only he could decode. Other candidates trembled, a few backed away. Aaron did neither. He stepped closer. "Why show us this?" he asked quietly. I answered with the honesty the chaplains avoid, because truth must be learned before it can be survived. The rumor that took hold next was one older than the chapter itself. The trial of the pit. It is not canon. It is not doctrine. But every inductee eventually hears it, that somewhere below the training yards lies a chamber used only once a generation, a place where darkness itself is given time and teeth, where a candidate enters alone and emerges reborn, or not at all. The reality is simpler, though no less cruel. The pit is merely a sensory deprivation shaft used to break the ego from the shell of the self. But recruits do not understand psychological thresholds. They understand death. So they speak of the pit as a maw of horrors. Some fear it, some crave it. Aaron Vos studied it. I found him one night in the archival annex, a forbidden place for candidates, standing before a hololithic diagram of the subterranean chambers. He did not turn when I entered. "Do all of us go?" he asked. "No," I said. "Only those who cannot decide whether they are human or something else." "And which am I?" he asked. I offered no answer. In truth, I did not know. It was around this time that the first institutional fractures appeared. Recruits rarely understand that their transformation is not only physical, it is political. Behind every implanted gland is a ledger. Behind every right is a regulation. Behind every failure is a budget line. The Adeptus Astartes do not operate outside the Imperium's machine. They are produced by it, and that machine stutters. The Administratum sent a compliance audit team, 12 pale functionaries bearing sigils of authority and a disdain for dirt. They measured everything: nutrient supplement ratios, servitor maintenance cycles, candidate mortality curves. They filled data slates with statistics no one would ever read. One auditor, a thin man with a skull mask etched into his breastplate, watched the recruits in silence for a full hour. I approached him. "Expecting deviation?" I asked. "Expecting truth," he replied. His voice was flat, measured. "We have received reports that certain irregular methods are used in your cohort. Methods not officially sanctioned." Irregular. That word is a blade. I controlled my breath. "There is nothing irregular about survival," he tapped his slate. "We shall see." Their presence altered everything. Drill sergeants barked commands with strained precision. Apothecaries closed doors that were normally ajar. Chaplains recited canon with unusual fervor. Recruits sensed the tension. They mimicked it, uncertain whether to fear us more than themselves. Rumors multiplied, but the real shift came on evaluation day. Every cohort undergoes a formal trial, endurance run, simulated engagement, reaction assessment, and moral stress test. Not all chapters use the moral test. Our chapter does. The Imperium has enemies seen and unseen, and a space marine must stand against both. We lined the recruits in the courtyard at dawn. The sky was a smeared bruise. The air tasted of coolant and violated stone. A row of servo skulls hovered above us, their optics recording every micro-act of hesitation. Aaron stood second from the front, shoulders squared, that quiet intensity radiating like an unspoken threat. The first test was mechanical. Run the perimeter, drag the weight, do not collapse. It separates the weak extremely fast. Candidate 4392 fell before the third marker. His lungs were insufficient. Servitors retrieved him. The second was cerebral. Identify threat angles in a rapid simulation. Dozens failed. Oren scored perfectly. The third was the moral test. This is how it works. A candidate is placed inside a caged corridor with flickering lumen strips. A shadow moves at the far end. A voice calls out, sometimes pleading, sometimes preaching, sometimes mocking. The candidate is told only one rule. Do you strike? Do you stand down? Do you speak? Do you hesitate? Correctness is irrelevant. Speed is everything. Hesitation kills an Astartes. Hesitation kills a chapter. The first 5 candidates hesitated. One begged forgiveness. One vomited. One froze. Aaron entered the corridor with no change in expression. The shadow moved. The voice whispered, "Help me." Aaron struck clean. Simple, without cruelty. He aimed for the thoracic center, exactly where an Astartes would strike. "That one," the apothecary murmured beside me, voice low. "He will live." But the true realization began after the test. Recruits are not supposed to see what happens after the corridor. They are herded away, debriefed, conditioned. Yet Aaron did not follow the others. He lingered, eyes narrowed, gaze sliding toward a maintenance bulkhead where a thin smear of blood marked the floor. That blood came from candidate 8820, who had been chosen as the Shadow, a moral test volunteer. His arm had been shattered. He would not return to training. Aaron inhaled once, sharply. I saw the thought strike him with the force of revelation. It was one of us, he said. Yes. And tomorrow it could be me. Yes. He closed his eyes as though memorizing the shape of pain. That means, he said slowly, that we are not being trained to be brothers. We are being trained to be weapons. Weapons must be reliable, I said. Weapons do not hesitate. He looked at me, and for the first time since the cages, his voice carried fear. Not of pain, not of death, but of truth. What happens to the weapons that break? They are melted down, I said honestly, and the Imperium begins again. That was the moment Aaron Voss ceased being a child of the Dust Warrens. It was the moment he saw the shape of the machine that was turning him into something else. The moment he realized that brotherhood is a story told to soldiers the way lullabies are told to children. Beautiful, comforting, but not meant for daylight. He did not cry. He did not rage. He simply absorbed the realization like metal taking heat. That is when I knew. He would either become a space marine, or he would die attempting to become one. There are no other paths. The transformation of a recruit is never confined to the training yards. There are chambers far above and far below where decisions shape flesh more severely than any scalpel. These chambers are where the true crucible burns. The Council of Induction convened on the 33rd day of the cycle, a date chosen not for spiritual significance, but for paperwork efficiency. Administratum monitors prefer that reports align with fiscal tallies. The machine of the Imperium cares nothing for symbolism. It cares for numbers. The council chamber lies beneath screening hall theta, its walls lined with purity seals older than any living member. Servo skulls glide between columns, recording every word. Candles burn not for light, but for ritual, flames guttering in drafts that smell of antiseptic, oil, and the quiet dread of bureaucracy. I arrived early. Drill abbots rarely speak in these meetings unless spoken to, but we listen. Listening is where the truth hides. One by one, the others entered first. Came Chaplain Vorn, robes black as void, skull helm under one arm. He walks as though gravity bends in apology beneath his boots. His presence is ceremonial and absolute. When he speaks, doctrine bends. Then Apothecary Helvar, his armor marked by a dozen surgical sigils. His gauntlets hum faintly, the sound of micro-servo motors trembling with restrained precision. Then the Administratum auditors, pale and stiff, bearing their slates like weapons. Then the representative of the Mechanicus, a tech priest whose cables slithered across the floor like metallic intestines. When they had all taken their stations, the lumen strips dimmed to the sanctioned level, and Chaplain Vorn struck the votive gong. Let the proceedings begin. The first portion of the council is always ceremonial. Roll calls, purity oaths, confirmations of protocol adherence. Then comes the part that matters, the review of the cohort. The 10th screening, began Auditor Sareth, shows immortality curve 4.3% above predicted models. The tech priest's Vox speaker crackled, acceptable deviation, biological variance trending upward, recommend continuation. Sareth frowned. Recommend review of psychological stress protocols. Apothecary Helvar tapped his gauntlet against the stone table. If we reduce stress exposure by even a fraction, we increase gene seed rejection. The numbers are clear. Numbers, Sareth repeated, do not concern themselves with ethical boundaries. Chaplain Vaughan turned his head slowly, like a turret aiming. Ethics, he said, do not concern themselves with survival. The air thickened. This is what recruits never see, their fate debated as if they are weapons being tested in a forge, which, in effect, they are. It was then that the matter of Candidate 7241 arose. Drill Abbot Varda, Auditor Sareth said, you have logged multiple observations regarding Candidate 7241's behavioral irregularities. Irregularities, another blade word. Clarify, he commanded. I stepped forward. Candidate 7241 demonstrates high pattern recognition, heightened situational awareness, and accelerated emotional compression. Emotional compression, Helvar asked. He processes fear rapidly, I said, converts it into action. He performed the moral test efficiently, but showed awareness of its mechanics afterward. Meaning? Sareth pressed. He understood that the target was another recruit, I said. He deduced the cost behind the illusion. The room shifted. Chaplain Vaughan's rasping voice cut through the silence. Awareness is not impurity. Yet awareness leads to questioning, Sareth countered. And questioning leads to heresy, Vaughan said, only when doctrine is weak. The conversation sharpened into technical cruelty. Auditor Sareth gestured toward his slate. This candidate's file indicates pre-induction defiance, evasion of local law, and a marked tendency toward observational dissociation. Good traits, Helvar said. Sareth glared. For a killer, perhaps. For an Astartes, Helvar corrected. There is no other requirement. The tech priest's vox spine clicked. Candidate 7241's biological readings remain within acceptable thresholds. Probability of gene seed compatibility, 73.2%. Recommend continuation. Continuation, Vaughan echoed, is ordained. Sareth exhaled sharply through his teeth. Very well, but the psychological markers still indicate potential, I interrupted. Every gaze turned toward me. I had spoken out of turn, but I continued. This candidate does not fear death. He fears the wrong death, death without purpose. That fear aligns him with doctrine, not against it. Chaplain Vaughan studied me. Do you vouch for him? I vouch for his trajectory, I said. Sareth made a note on his slate with sharp, disapproving taps. The council moved on, but the disruption lingered. In such rooms, even a sentence becomes a fault line. When the meeting adjourned, I lingered, gathering my scrolls. Apothecary Helvar approached, helm tucked beneath his arm. You speak boldly, he said. I speak honestly. That is a rare luxury, Helvar said, especially in these halls. He paused, then lowered his voice. The boy is strong, but strength is not enough. I know. He will suffer. All of them will, but his suffering may sharpen him in ways others cannot survive. Suffering is the Emperor's chisel, I said. Helvar gave a thin, brief smile, the sort that never reached his eyes. Then let us hope he is made of stone. On the surface above, the recruits were not idle. The rest of that cycle was the indoctrination phase, a period of enforced ritual, study, and controlled deprivation meant to strip away whatever fragments of identity the earlier trials had missed. The training monks took over then, robed figures who spoke in tones somewhere between prayer and threat. Recruits memorized catechisms until their tongues went numb. They copied litanies onto parchment until their hands cramped. They stood in meditation chambers where silence was so absolute, it felt like a physical force pressing into the skull, and through all of it, Aaron moved differently. Not superior, not rebellious, just aware. He watched the monks with the same precision he had once used to study exits. He repeated the prayers perfectly, but his eyes flicked, subtle, sharp, to each symbol on the wall, as though mapping an order hidden beneath the ritual. Most recruits lose themselves in the indoctrination. That is the point. Arin did not lose himself. He hid himself. The second realization moment came during the Purity Recital. This is a ceremony where recruits recite the Creed of Becoming before a panel of chaplains. It is not just liturgical. It is diagnostic. A misstressed syllable can indicate doubt. A tremor in the voice can indicate guilt. Everything is measured. The chamber was built like a shrine, vaulted ceiling, candelabras, an altar shaped like an open book. The air tasted of incense, sharp, metallic, derived from oils collected from the remains of past heroes. One by one, they stepped forward. Most recited the creed with shaky voices. A few stumbled. 2 fainted. Then Aran stepped before the altar. His voice was steady, measured, echoing through the chamber with a weight that felt too large for his frame. But it was his eyes that unbalanced me. Not devotion. Not fear. Something else. Something dangerously close to comprehension. When he finished, Chaplain Vaughn leaned forward. "What do you understand of purity, child?" Aran answered without pause. "Purity is the removal of what cannot endure." Vaughn's helm tilted slightly. "And what cannot endure?" Aran looked up at the altar flame. "Memory," he said. "Doubt. Choice." The chaplains murmured, some impressed, others uneasy. Vaughn folded his arms. "And do you accept this loss?" Slowly, Aran exhaled. "No," he said. A collective intake of breath rippled through the hall. "But," he continued, "I accept that wanting to keep them does not matter." The hall fell silent. Chaplain Vaughn studied him for a long, motionless moment. "Proceed," Vaughn finally said, voice low. The ceremony resumed, but nothing felt the same. 6:18. Later that night, I found Aran alone in the reflection chamber, an octagonal room lined with polished obsidian plates meant to distort one's shape, symbolizing the shedding of the old self. He sat cross-legged on the cold stone, head bowed. I stepped inside. "You spoke boldly," I said. He did not look up. "I spoke truth." "Truth is costly," I said. "Everything here is costly," he replied, "especially silence." I sat across from him, the obsidian walls bending our reflections until we looked like elongated shadows. "What troubles you?" I asked. He lifted his head. His eyes flicked across the warped reflections as though searching for something human in the distortions. "You're all preparing us to forget," he said. "To forget who we were. To forget what we loved. To forget why we ever wanted to survive." "Yes," I said. "And you expect us not to notice?" "No," I said. "I expect you to decide whether survival matters more than memory." He breathed steadily. "And if it does not, then you will die?" He nodded once. Not acceptance, not resignation. Recognition. 6:33. The third realization moment came the following dawn. Just hours before the next trial, we found a recruit dead. Not by servitor, not by trial, by his own hand. He had broken beneath the weight of what we had taken from him. His name, his face, his future, his place in a world that would no longer accept him. Recruits are never supposed to see such things. But Aran saw. He was in the corridor when the body was discovered. He heard the gasps. He saw the chaplain's ritual dismissal. He watched the servitors carry away the fallen boy with the efficiency of a factory conveyor. He did not cry, he did not tremble. He simply whispered under his breath, "One less." Then his voice hardened. "That could be me." He looked at me. "And that could be you." I held his stare. "It could," I said, "but it is not." And that was the moment, dark, cold, irreversible, when Aran Vos stopped being a candidate caught between fear and destiny. In that instant, he became something else entirely. a being who understood that the path to becoming an Astartes is paved not with glory, but with graves, a being who realized that recruits do not survive because they are strong. They survive because they learn which pieces of themselves to bury, a being on the edge of transformation, and the next trial would push him over it. The moment a recruit passes from ritual to incision, everything changes. Ritual is patient and slow. Incision is absolute and immediate. Where ritual carves memory with words, incision rewrites marrow with metal and code. We called it the Ascension sequence. It is a polite name for a violent thing, lots of soft syllables wrapped around a hard, bright reality. The sequence begins in the subcellar, a room below rooms, beneath the conditioning halls, lined with sterile tesserae that reflect lamplight into geometric insistence. The ceilings sweat with sterile condensation. The air smells of ozone and preserved bone. Prayer bells lie on an altar as if for comfort, but their tolls come later. I had presided over a dozen ascensions. Each one leaves a small track on the soul, like the run of a lathe across metal. You learn the rhythm, the prep, the induction, the opening of the marrow, the administration of gene enzymes, the binding of ceramite anchors, and finally the long, terrible slough as the body either accepts or rejects. Candidate 7241's name, Aaron Vos, had been only a memory for some weeks, but his face remained stubborn in my mind. When the order came to prepare him for the Ascension sequence, I felt the familiar tightening that precedes judgment. He came to the subcellar with the same measured gait he used in trials. No bravado, no pleading, only the quiet clarity of a thing that has counted costs and chosen to pay them. The tech priests moved with their subtle rituals. A scratched sigil here, a whirring servo there, a low intoned recitation of formulae that would be called heretical in other contexts. Apothecary Helvar supervised the preparation, his gauntlet fingers tracing the pattern of the ceramite anchors with an almost affectionate precision. Chaplain Vorn stood at the threshold, a black silhouette against the lumen glow. "You understand the rites?" Helvar asked without looking up. "I understand loss," Aaron said. Helvar's eyes, augmented and clinical, studied him for a long moment. Loss is the scaffolding of our kind. The first incision is always the quietest. We sedate them not to spare the pain. Pain is useful, but to steady the muscles and clear the mind. The apothecaries chant in low, clipped phrases as they thread microcatheters. The tech priests feed calibrations into the gene seed receiver. The first enzyme enters the blood with the soft hiss of steam on hot metal. Aaron's vitals trembled for an instant. His jaw clenched. His hands, held down by servitor restraints, did not shake. Then the marrow opened. You cannot understand the sound of marrow opening until you have stood beside a man while his bones are rearranged. It is not an organ noise. It is the noise of scaffolding being torn out and rebuilt, a dry, granular tearing that sounds like gravel moved under pressure. The monitors stuttered. Lights dimmed as if in sympathy. Chaplain Vorn began a benediction. Low, formal, the sort of thing meant to calm souls and justify transgression. "Emperor guide," he intoned. "Emperor preserve." Some take the sequence like the sea takes a stone, immediate, smooth, indifferent. Others seize and convulse, a violent convulsion that ends some lives in minutes. The apothecaries record every twitch. The lab techs notch down the percentages. The administratum audits the tallies, balancing the ledger. Aaron convulsed. Then he went very still. The first day of binding is the day you learn whether a recruit has the marrow to accept the ceramite. The plates are bonded through a lattice of ossified connection. Ceramite anchors sink into bone like slow teeth. For many, the anchors integrate. For some, the bone fractures and refuses to knit. For a tiny, blessed few, the marrow loves the metal as if it had always been part of it. I watched the monitors. I watched the readouts. I watched the apothecary's jaw move as he whispered calibration prayers to his instruments. The room smelled of ozone and the iron of heated blood. Arin's indicators rose, the bonding curve smoothed, the ceramite plates hummed like a natal chorus. "We have clean adhesion," Helvar said at last. They eased him from the table. He blinked, confused for a breath, then focused. The chaplain moved forward with the prayer bell. He struck it thrice. The sound was not triumphant, it was confirmation. Yet, acceptance is only the beginning. After integration, there comes the months of augmentation, hours of implants, hours of neural grafting, the insertion of adjuvant organs that regulate adrenaline and suppress traumatic memory. There are nights where recruits scream until their voices are grating into silence. There are days where they move like gods and laugh like children. Arin endured and excelled. He learned the new weight of his hands as if practicing with a weapon, balancing mass and intent, with an ease that betrayed the long calculations that still rested behind his eyes. He recovered faster than any cohort average. His bone knit, his reflex arcs rewired. Memory sloughed in small surgical increments. The chaplains taught him to fold loss into ritual until what remained was the form of obedience and the shape of violence. And yet something persisted. In the quiet hours after the augmentations and when the antiseptic odor had been scrubbed from the air, Arin would sit and stare at the small vial on my desk. The one that contained a grain of black sand I kept as a talisman for the costs of becoming. He would not touch it. He would not speak. But sometimes, when the lamps dimmed and the training yard sighed, I would find him standing by the viewport, looking out over the manufactorum fields, as if measuring their distance from some point inside himself. "Do you miss anything?" I asked once. He did not answer immediately. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "I miss the way my mother braided my hair with wire. It was a small thing, a memory we had all assumed would be gone, but his voice carried it as if it were a relic." "That can be kept," I said. "No," he replied, "not the braid. The way she did it because she had nothing else." I miss that knowing. I knew then that his loss would not be complete. Some fragments survive augmentation, snippets of childhood, ghosts of hunger, a small comfort that refuses to burn. The Administratum's audit team returned with new directives. Mortality curves warranted stricter protocol. Psychological screening would be intensified. Where policy had previously allowed small humane adjustments, the auditors now required conformity. Faster cycles, stricter isolation between recruits, expanded moral testing. They argued efficiency, they argued survival. Their language was not cruel, it was practical. The chaplains called for a period of increased penance and meditation. The Mechanicus requested more access for diagnostic instruments. The fabricator representative demanded additional alloy shipments for ceramite. The council issued mandates that tightened like a corset around a ship about to accelerate. We complied. We have always complied. But the personal costs accumulated. One night, a recruit removed his identity band and tried to flee. He ran across the yard under stuttering lights with the desperation of a man who remembered his mother's hands. Servitors struck him with nets. He bled out in the gutter, caught like refuse in a drain. I watched the boys file past his body at morning mustering and note how some looked away quickly while others, few and the lucky few, looked as if they had seen only a lesson. Arin stood silent. He did not flinch. But when the chaplain led the catechism that morning, he missed a line. Not because he lacked faith now that his marrow had bonded with ceramite, but because for a moment his mind had reached for something the catechism could not hold. The final stage before induction into a battle brotherhood is socialization, rites of shared blood and bonded purpose. We place recruits in shared barracks and force them into communal tasks to form dependency and trust. Bonds are forged in hardship and in mocked laughter. They become the scaffolding of brotherhood. We staged these exercises in extremes. They scrubbed floors until the skin of their hands fainted. They fought mock engagements with simulacra that spat live rounds. They shared rations until the smallest portion tasted of victory. Aran formed attachments. Not many, few recruits do, but one shaped him. A quiet lad from a river world named Jalen, who laughed in the wrong places and defended a fallen sergeant's memory with a ferocity that startled them all. Jalen had a habit of humming under his breath, a tune that no one knew the origin of. One night, after a field exercise that left them all aching, Aran and Jalen sat under the rare sky pulse and drank thin broth. Jalen smiled at him. "You'll be a good soldier, Aran," he said. Aran smiled a little. "You will be too." The next week, Jalen failed a moral assessment. He froze in the corridor when the voice begged for aid. He trembled and could not decide. He was carried away to the med block. He did not return. Aran learned that day that brotherhood was provisional. It lived only as long as each man performed his function. Beyond that, bones were expendable. He placed his hand on the small vial of black sand on my desk, then, without looking at me, "Is that what you keep?" he asked. "I keep it, so I remember," I said. "Remember what?" he asked. "The price," I said. He nodded slowly. "Then I will remember it for you," he said. And with those words, I understood more clearly than ever before what the Ascension sequence does. It teaches men to bury their pasts, offers them new bodies and new purposes, and expects the rest to be payment rendered without complaint. Aureen's bones took the metal and sang. His mind absorbed the calculus. His heart kept a small corner of a mother's braid, like a locked box. The induction bell tolled the next morning. We rang it as a confirmation. We rang it as a promise. We rang it because there was nothing else left to do. When the machine of the Imperium shows a hairline crack, enemies read it as an invitation. Rumor, audit, and ritual are internal matters. Predators notice only the outward tremor. And so the crisis that began in the screening yards found its echo in the void. The first signal came as a routine astropathic ping, low priority, anonymized, then a cascade of higher priority relays, unconfirmed skirmishes at the fringe, border convoys interdicted. A merchant convoy burned and left as a warning. The navlogs called it opportunism. The Admiralty called it probing. The men on the decks called it hunger. I heard the reports from the flag bridge as if they were happening in a canyon, distant, amplified, and impossible to ignore. Admiral Korsh's voice over the comms was taut but steady. "We will hold the perimeter," he promised. "We will not let erosion become contagion. But erosion is not always visible. It begins in faith and rumors and in the slow reallocation of resources. Forge shipments were delayed. Alloy manifests arrived months late. The Mechanicus pressed for prioritization. The Administratum argued for triage. The High Lords issued communiques and then withdrew them when clerks could not agree on phrasing that would not inflame already fragile sectors. We felt the pressure in the yards. Recruitment quotas were increased without additional resources. Where we had once been permitted the luxury of cautious integration, the new directives demanded speed. More recruits processed, faster ascensions, wider deployments. The auditors, pale, unsmiling, wrote new targets on their slates as if they were injunctions from heaven. The chaplains muttered prayers that tasted of fatigue. The moral calculus narrowed. There are only so many men, only so much marrow. If the Adeptus Astartes could no longer be a force multiplier by craft and legend, then numbers would have to suffice. The Administratum proposed vast retraining programs for the Imperial Guard, but that would take years. The Mechanicus proposed automated battle suits. The Ecclesiarchy proposed mass penance to harden spirit. Each plan required time the Imperium did not possess. We mobilized. The 10th screening cohort was ordered to expand, 2 additional cohorts to be absorbed, an accelerated pipeline, forward deployment lists drafted for holding actions at sector borders. The 112th Morian Regiment, our old ally in logistics, was reassigned, and the fleet overhead rechanneled ships toward choke points. Orders arrived like snowflakes and then hardened into ice. Mobilize, consolidate, hold. Aron Voss found himself placed on the forward roster. The men who had once been boys in cages were now to be the thin edge of a blade. We drilled them with new drills, hold the line until relief, coordinate with naval orbital bombardments, fall back in organized intervals if overrun. The training shifted from forging inwardly to performing outwardly. The machine had to prove itself. The first campaign theater was a hollow world on the outer rim, Kuranis IV, with its grain fields and fragile civitas. It was not an important world by galactic metric, but its fall would create a cascade of shortage and hunger that would doom neighboring systems to panic. The fleet's orders were simple: secure the capital, hold the star routes, prevent contagion. We sent a detachment, a spearhead comprised of recruits recently ascended, supported by veteran guard companies. The recruits wore their ceramite like a promise. Some of them liked the feel of weight beneath their shoulders for the first time in their lives. They learned to stand like statues that move. I gave Aron his orders in the half-light before launch. He accepted them without fanfare, fingers trailing over the small vial of black sand on my desk, as if to steady himself on a remembered shore. "You are not yet brothers," I said. "You are a line." He nodded. "And if you break?" "We do not break," he said. "We make space for those who cannot." It was a machine answer. It was also a human one. War is a clarifying force. It makes ethics sharp and expedient. On Kuranis, we found the enemy not as a grand host, but as insurgents and saboteurs. They used the panics, the food shortages, the local grievances. They used rumor as a blade. They struck convoys, cut power nodes, set fire to the granaries. Our forces moved like a machine trying to plug 100 holes at once. The recruits performed. They moved with precise, practiced cruelty. They pulled survivors from burning wagons. They stormed barricades with the cold efficiency of men taught to obey without question. And when a line of insurgents tried to overrun a supply convoy, Aron stood with his men and did what he had been forged to do. He fired. He advanced. He closed the distance. One insurgent, a young man with a face ravaged by starvation, fell in front of Aron. The recruit did not look away. He finished the action as trained. There was no gloating. There was a flatness of execution. Later, in the quiet of the barracks, Aron touched the corner of his mouth and wept once, silently, into his palm. The campaign hardened them further. They learned to hold until relief came, to move back only when ordered, to bury friends with official rights that felt too small. They learned the calculus of survival, the price of a strategic withdrawal, the mercy of a single well-aimed salvo that spares a flank. War taught them to be parts of a machine. It did not teach them how to keep a memory, and the Imperium took notice. A dispatch arrived on the second week. The administratum required complete accounting of all recruits deployed, casualty estimates, attrition predictions. The fabricator general requested additional ceramite shipments and warned that without increased supply lines, the next rotation would see catastrophic failure rates. The Ecclesiarchy demanded that any unit returning with fewer than 60% intact must undergo ritual penance and public testimony to galvanize the faithful. "Public testimony," one commissar scoffed, "is a luxury in war." "Faith is a utility," the chaplain replied. "Do not confuse ritual with sentiment." It was about then that the first large-scale moral reckoning arrived. The High Lords convened a field tribunal to review the new doctrine. Representatives came with their own agendas. The Mechanicus seeking experimental clearance for undead automata, the Administratum pushing for mass conscription, the Ecclesiarchy demanding renewed sanctification rites, and the Inquisition, a pale shadow of its own power, watching for heresy. The tribunal debated in tones that did not touch the field mud. They argued in circles and about charts, and about doctrine while men in the dirt died on the edges. I received a summons to attend not as a petitioner but as a witness. They wanted my testimony about the recruits' readiness and the efficacy of accelerated ascension. I dressed in the drab official gray and carried my ledger, because what else do you carry into such rooms but proofs? The tribunal chamber was colder than most council rooms, air-conditioned to sterile dignity, as if the debate were surgical. When I spoke, I was blunt. The recruits hold, I said. They follow orders. They sustain the line, but we pay for each victory with a record. The lost are many. The surviving are fewer than the makers predicted. You can increase production, but you cannot create meaning. An auditor tapped his slate. Meaning is not our remit, Drill Abbot. Then you make weapons, not men, I replied. A chaplain, thin-faced with eyes like coals, leaned forward. Then give us weapons that pray, he said. Give us soldiers whose rituals are strong enough to bind them. Or, I said, teach your administrators that the body is not an inexhaustible well. The room hummed with the thin sound of policy grinding against reality. They made notes. They issued mandates. They sent us home with new directives: accelerate production, broaden scope, maintain morale. By the time we returned to the training yards, the change was palpable. Men who had left for Kuranis returned with eyes older than their faces. Some of them returned with medals, some returned in crates. The yards smelled of diesel and mourning. The recruits who remained trained harder. The recruits who had gone learned what it meant to be part of a mortal shield. Aran returned with scars that ran like topography across his forearms. He had seen things that had cut him into a new shape. He greeted me with a nod and no further question. "You did well," I said. "We did what was required," he answered. And yet, he said, "I still remember the braid." I did not ask which braid he meant. I did not need to. The small things remain. The crisis had no single epicenter. It was diffuse. A war here, an audit there, a speech by a high lord that soothed some and inflamed others. The Imperium would survive this season as it had survived others, through sacrifice, through policy, through myth. But inside the screening yards, the ledger had grown heavy. Names were thinning. Numbers were climbing. I looked at the vial on my desk and felt the weight of an empire pressing at the edges of a single grain of sand. The next day, the Administratum sent a courier with a sealed missive, new quotas, new timelines, and an additional line. Begin preparation for publicizing the Astartes, not as angels returning, but as an evolution of man, part technology, part doctrine, wholly useful. The language was careful, the intent was clear. We would sell the myth anew. But myth, once reshaped too forcibly, becomes brittle. And brittle things break with little warning. There comes a moment in every cohort when the strain that has been quietly accumulating, across bone, across doctrine, across the thin membranes of sanity, finally announces itself, not with a scream, not with a rebellion, with a silence so dense, so pregnant, that every servo skull hovering above the yards seems to slow its hum in obedience. That silence arrived on the 97th night of the cycle. It began with a malfunction in the North Barracks lumen grid, a flicker, a dimming, a brief blackout, the sort of thing that should mean nothing. But in the gloom, one recruit began whispering the catechism backwards. Another sat rocking, hands pressed over his ears, repeating the name of a mother we had surgically removed from his memory months earlier. A third carved the sigil of the Emperor into his thigh with a ration tin. Stress fractures, just like in Ceramite. We quarantined the barrack and called for Chaplain Vaughan. He arrived like judgment incarnate, robes trailing, vox amplifier glowing, prayer scriptures cascading from his loudspeaker with that low, resonant tone that could steady nerves and terrify souls in equal measure. But even he paused when he saw what the blackout had revealed. Dozens of recruits standing in absolute stillness, not praying, not trembling, simply staring at the ceiling as if waiting for something to descend. Apothecary Helvar whispered to me, "Neural stress. They are reaching thresholds faster than predicted." Thresholds, I repeated quietly. Another blade word. The lights snapped back on. The roar of 1,000 vents returned. Training resumed, at least on the surface. But we all knew something had shifted. The machine was straining. That was the night Aaron Voss came to me. Not as a recruit, not as a supplicant, but as something in between a weapon and a confession. He stood at my doorway in silence. His silhouette filled the frame, not yet wearing battle plate, but broad enough to remind me what we had built inside his bones. "You requested entry?" I asked. He nodded. I gestured him inside. He stepped in. He sat. For a long, fragile moment, he said nothing. Finally, "The others are breaking." His voice was flat, a statement, not a plea. "Yes," I said. "They weren't weak," he said. "They followed the rites. They passed the trials. They believed." "Belief doesn't prevent fracture," I said. He looked at the vial of black sand on my desk. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in understanding. "You keep that so you remember the cost." "Yes." "And do you?" he asked. "Yes." He breathed once, a slow exhale, and then, "What happens when the cost exceeds the worth?" It was the nearest to heresy he had ever approached, but it was not an accusation, it was an observation, clinical, measured, born of a battlefield where logic mattered more than scripture. I answered the only way honesty allowed. "Then the Imperium pays it anyway." The next day, war arrived at our doorstep. Not rumors, not audits, not projections in glowing hololiths. War. The first explosion came from the outer trench line, a deep, ugly concussion that shook dust loose from the rafters and made the alarm klaxons scream in 3 different octaves. An enemy probe force, rogue militia mixed with off-world mercenaries, testing whether the screening yard could be breached. They had chosen well. Our defenses were under repairs, our attention divided, our command chain stretched thin across a galaxy in crisis. We sounded full mobilization. Recruits who had never seen a true battlefield were thrust into formation. Without ceremony, Aaron was among them. The training yards transformed in minutes. Drill squares became kill zones. Meditation halls became fallback positions. Barracks became barricades. Smoke poured through ruptured vents. Vox commands snapped like electrical discharge. Servo skulls dove through the smoke, updating casualty statistics in real time. The first wave of attackers scaled the perimeter fence, ragged, feral, armed with stolen lay carbines and improvised explosives. Recruits engaged not calmly, not flawlessly, but with the raw, instinctive violence of men who had been taught for months that hesitation was a death sentence. Aaron moved like the doctrine had intended, clean, precise, decisive. But I watched his eyes between strikes and saw something the chaplains would never understand. He was not fighting for doctrine. He was fighting to keep the fragile cohesion of the cohort from collapsing entirely. He was fighting because the others could not afford for him not to. The attackers reached the inner courtyard. Chaplain Vorn led a counter-push, scripture blazing from his vox, a terrifying sound that made even our recruits stand straighter. Apothecary Helvar moved like a surgical blade, stabilizing one recruit, euthanizing another, embedding a stim dose in a third who'd lost too much blood to stay conscious. I coordinated fallback lines. But as the courtyard filled with smoke and bodies, as alarms blared and air turned metallic, as recruits screamed battle cries that were half prayer, half panic, a realization struck me with brutal clarity. This was the true test. Not the cages, not the pit, not the marrow binding or the moral corridor. This chaos, this failure of structure, this demand for action without instruction. This was the moment that made or broke an Astartes, because the Emperor had never designed them to be followers. He had designed them to act when orders failed. The attackers breached the chapel steps. Aaron intercepted them. He did not wait for command. He did not wait for formation. He led, not with speeches, not with oaths. With motion, he cut through the breach with controlled brutality, every strike economical, every movement ruthless and exact. Other recruits followed because movement is contagious in battle, especially movement that promises survival. The tide shifted. Helvar shouted into the vox, "Anchor the line, press forward!" We regained the courtyard, we regained the trench, we regained the perimeter, and then, just like that, it was over. Bodies lay across the shattered ground, insurgents, recruits, servitors. Smoke curled upward in slow coils. The klaxons fell silent one by one, each muted as if out of respect for the newly dead. Aaron stood in the center of the courtyard, la carbine hanging loosely from one hand, blood running down his forearm like a ceremonial stripe. He did not shake, he did not revel, he simply breathed. I approached him. "You disobeyed direct orders," I said quietly. "Yes." "You acted alone." "Yes." "You led without permission." "Yes." "And why?" I asked. He looked at the broken chapel doors. He looked at the bodies of recruits who had followed him. He looked at the sky, gray, industrial, unfeeling. "Because no one else did." Not defiant, not proud, just true. Truth spoken simply. 1303, that was the moment. The precise moment the transformation became irreversible. Not when the ceramite fused, not when the glands bonded, not when the sermons sank into the subconscious. Here, in the courtyard, where chaos demanded a will strong enough to stand alone, I felt something inside my chest shift. A recognition, a dread, a distant echo of pride that chaplains would call impure. He was ready. Not perfect, not obedient, but ready. The next day, Chaplain Vorn confirmed the inevitable. Candidate 7241 will advance to the final oath. The final oath ceremony is not grand. The Imperium does not waste grandeur on beginnings. It takes place in a chamber of ancient basalt, lit only by the glow of purity seals and the flicker of a single brazier. The air smells of smoke and history. Aaron knelt. Vorn recited the ancient rubric. Helvar stood at his side. I held the scroll bearing his designation. The parchment stiff and heavy with centuries of tradition, Aaron repeated each line with clarity. Not because he believed every word, but because he understood their weight. When the ritual ended, Vorn placed a gauntleted hand on his shoulder. "Rise." Aaron rose, but the boy who had entered the cages on day one did not rise with him. Only the weapon remained. After the oath, Aaron approached me privately. "What now?" he asked. I considered the question carefully. "Now you serve," I said. He nodded slowly. "And you?" he asked. "What do you do?" I looked at the vial of black sand, the one constant in every cycle, every failure, every transformation. "I begin again," I said. He looked at the vial. He looked at me. He understood. He bowed his head, not in reverence, but in respect. Then, "Remember me," he said. "I will," I answered. He turned, walked away, vanished into the corridor that led toward the armory. And that is the truth of what happens to Space Marine recruits. Not the propaganda, not the statues, not the hymns, not the hololithic displays broadcast to the masses on Holy Terra. This, cages, fear, loss, transformation bone that groans under sacred metal, screams swallowed by ceremony, bonds forged in silence, a moment of crisis where a weapon chooses to act without permission, and a final oath spoken by someone who once had a name, a mother, a memory of a braid, a childhood in the dust warrens, all of it burned out, shaped, distilled into a single purpose: to stand where others fall. The Imperium does not create heroes. It creates the minimum number of survivors required to call its losses acceptable. That is the truth. That is the price. That is what really happens to Space Marine recruits.